Hello and welcome to our Passion for Moms webinar series that motherhood is a leadership opportunity in our families and in the platforms that God has given us. And we are thrilled to be with you again. And so today we have with us Neomi Sarmiento, and I am excited for you to have the opportunity to hear her, learn from her, and to be able to learn just how we can continue to grow as mothers and the leadership opportunities that God has given us. So welcome, Neomi. It is so good to have you. And Neomi Sarmiento, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing these days.
Great. So I'm Neomi Sarmiento, and I'm mom to two beautiful children, Emma, who is 12, and Elam, who is 10. And I'm also a pastor's wife. My husband is a pastor at a church here in California. We are in the Central Valley, which is about a couple hours from San Francisco and about 4 hours from LA. So it's a valley. So we are where we are located. This is probably where, if you get any produce from California, this is where it comes from. We are a farming community. So it's very, very tranquil and very calm area, very community oriented area. I'm also a Spanish teacher at a small private school in the area, and I love it. I love working with my students. I'm also very passionate about working with the women at our church. I'm very involved in our church. So we've been here probably almost 2 years. It'll be 2 years in August. So that we've been here. Yes.
So you have your hands full if you're juggling home life, Spanish teacher, and a pastor's wife. You have a lot on your plate.
Yes.
How has, so I know that from talking to other moms, there's a lot of juggling and being flexible and a lot thrown on parents as they've had to learn how to navigate homeschooling unexpectedly over the last few months. I guess most of the schools have ended now, but what was it like for you as a teacher to be able to make that adjustment so quickly? And maybe what was the biggest learning experience you had? Or maybe something you would like to say to us as parents, of something you would want us to learn from this experience from your perspective.
Sure. So one of the things that I went into the whole experience with was with that attitude of being flexible. And I remember, so I worked with Shaman on her committee and for Passion4Moms. And I remember one of the first staff meetings you said, everybody get your finger and do this. And then you said, we have to be flexible. And so when I was teaching my students, so we knew that it was coming. We knew that there was a possibility that we were going to be doing distance learning. So before our school called it, we were already prepping the students for it. And so I remember I did the same thing. I said, okay, everybody lift your finger and everybody go like this. And I did that with every class. And I told them, hey, we have to be flexible. We have to be flexible. I'm going to be flexible with you guys. This is what I'm planning to do, but if it doesn't work out and I see it's not working, I'm going to be flexible and learn I need to change this, as well as you need to be flexible with us as we learn this and we're navigating this, because we don't know how long it's going to be. We don't know what it's going to look like. It may be challenging. Some of you guys may have issues with internet and all this stuff. So let's just be flexible. And they're like, oh, okay. And I think that perspective really helped when you start something that's challenging, is being aware, like having this posture of being able to be flexible. And I think that really helped my framework going into it, not only as a teacher, but also as a mom, like being flexible with my kids as they also learn this approach and trying to balance. Now I'm teaching at home, but also I'm homeschooling. So doing both things, which was a little challenging at first, but then, we got our rhythm and it was fine. And so I think really it was about being flexible. I think, and I don't know if parents realize how much work it was on teachers. and so just being aware of that, like, you sending us tons of emails, like if we don't respond right away, just being patient, because it's a lot of work. I definitely feel like as a language teacher, and even talking to other teachers, English teachers and math teachers, for us, it was probably more work, because a lot of things that we do in the classroom are very discussion based, or very like, a lot of practice in the classroom. And so now you're having to go, and a lot of that stuff isn't graded. And so now you're having to go to a different type of changing your activities. So you're planning more, you're grading more. So it's definitely more work. And so just being, also parents being flexible with teachers, understanding that for some of us, this is more work, and we're still trying to figure it out too. We weren't trained to be online teachers. So just being flexible with the teachers as well.
That's one of the things that I've really observed throughout this whole last several months is we're so quick to want everything to operate like clockwork for me, that very selfish mindset as far as what's best for me and my children and my house. And yet, the schools and the colleges that are trying to do the best they can. And, you're working with so many different people and so many different classroom styles and different kinds of learning abilities for students. And so just being patient and recognizing that, everybody is doing the best they can, and just show kindness and grace towards everyone, recognizing that it's hard, they're not trying to be difficult, they're doing the best they can. And just that we as parents can really encourage and pray for and just really support the teachers and the administration, whether that's on a lower school level, high school or college level, that we show a lot of grace and recognizing that it's a lot. And you guys as teachers just being thrust in that so quickly and having to turn on a dime. It also reminds me, Naomi, of just how that life lesson is so important for us as moms, as leaders, because I think mothers in particular have the opportunity in the family to help our children understand that there's always going to be things that we're thrown, that life throws us. And that can be in our marriages, that can be in a career, that can be a pandemic. But just being able to teach our children and model for them that leadership is servant leadership. It's showing grace. It's showing flexibility, like you said, and just being able to operate with when life does throw us a curveball, that we do have that flexibility to be able to navigate that well. Have there been any other particular life lessons, even with your kids or students, that you saw that either handled well or maybe not so well, that just for us as moms to have that learning opportunity of how to do that better?
Well, I think part of our human nature is it's so easy to complain, right? And so there is a tendency, I see that a lot with students, that those teenage years, they can't complain. They can find something negative easily. It's much harder to find something positive. So one of the things that I did when students would start complaining about things, I would always try to point out something positive. And always say, well, we should be grateful that we have this platform and you're able to learn this way. There are some schools that aren't able to do this yet. And so we were one of the only schools in our whole district that actually started distance learning immediately once the quarantine started. Yeah. And so our school was very well prepared. A lot of other schools did not start until like a month later. And so, it was one of the things that I pointed out, like, hey, aren't you glad that we're still able to, we started right away, immediately, as soon as we were quarantined, we started right away. And I try to highlight those things. I'm like, would you rather have to end like in July? And they're like, no. So it's always about pointing out what we can be grateful for, and being in a Christian environment, able to share that with them, like, hey, we should be grateful that we have these opportunities. There's kids that don't. And so it's always about pointing back to our God and pointing back to what we're grateful for what he's provided.
That's so good. That's one of the things that we've tried to do consistently at night, just around the dinner table, is asking our girls, tell me 3 things you're grateful for, and just have that constant replay of every day that's your mindset of what are you grateful for. And that's something so easy that we can, it's the whole train your brain. If we train our brain to think for looking for the good and looking of how we can be grateful in challenging situations, and how we can model that for our children and help teach them, then they, even in that next generation, instead of being quick to complain, then they're going to be much more quick to find the gold nuggets in life. One of the things that I have admired about you, Naomi, for so many years is how you care so well for your family, for your husband, for your children, as well as caring for the people that you have been entrusted with in the classroom. And I think one of the things that I love in these webinars is being able to celebrate the platforms that God gives each of us uniquely. And your platform is not my platform. And that's been so fun in all these webinars to be able to highlight different mothers' platforms in the home, as well as the voices that God has given them to shine his light outside the home. And I've admired so much how you take that so seriously to really invest in your home, as well as invest in the students' lives. Tell me a little bit about how you learned to do that so well, and maybe some ways that has uniquely given you a voice to shine the love of Jesus inside and outside the home, to use that particular platform.
Sure. I want to say, when you say, how did I learn that so well? I want to say it all started in my own home. And so I grew up in a Christian home, and my parents were pastors and missionaries. And so I saw both of them, but my dad is more of the extrovert. And so he's very friendly, and he will meet anyone and find out all your family history. It's just his personality. But in doing that, he really showed that he cared about a person. And so I remember going to the grocery store, and my dad would be talking to the cashier, and then I'd be like, Dad, how do you know that person? Oh, I just met them. And then the next time he'd ask them, if they mentioned anything about their kids or anything, he'd remember, and he'd ask them, about their family and about their, how's your wife doing? And she was sick last time we talked. And sometimes they don't even remember my dad, but he remembers. And it just shows that he cares. And those little things make such a big difference. Mm-hmm. And so I started learning to do that when I'm talking to my students and asking them not just about the subject that I'm teaching them, but about their lives and how are things at home, and how's your mom? Well, you said your mom was sick. Tell me more about that. Really developing these friendships or not relationships with them, and really getting to know who they are. And I did learn that early on from my parents. My mom's the same way. She's quieter than my dad is, but they're both the same way, and really getting to know people and showing even just simply by remembering their names, and their kids' names. And I think that was one way in which my parents really taught me how to care for others.
Isn't that amazing how a simple just taking an interest in other people and asking questions goes so far with people, of feeling absolutely loved and wanted. Tell me a little bit about, you mentioned that you were a missionary's kid. So tell me where you grew up on the mission field, and what did that look like as a child to have that kind of experience, and how did maybe that prepare you for some of your experiences, or that you can look back and didn't know that you were being prepared, but those roots were really growing deep for the platforms that you've been given today?
Mm-hmm. So I think I'm originally from California. My family were Californians. And when I was about 8 years old, we moved to Central America, specifically to Costa Rica. We were there for 6 years, and then we moved to Panama for 2 years. So I was there for a total of 8 years. So I was about 16 when we moved back. So at that point, half of my life had been in Central America. So it very much did, that experience did really mold me into the person I was. And I think one of the things was how much, just because of the poverty there, as well as a lot of the struggles that people experience, it really had helped me to not be so inner focused. And I think a lot of, growing up in the United States is very different. It's very self-focused. And I think growing up in a community too, where or culture that is very Hispanic culture, they're very community oriented. So it's all about how can you help others. And I think growing up in that community really helped me to mold that sense of helping others and wanting to be part of a community and wanting to help others and not being so self-focused. So when we moved back, it was a huge culture shock for me. I remember telling my parents, like, I don't understand why my friends are so selfish. Like, they're so selfish. Like, all they do is talk about themselves and what they're wearing and all what brands they're wearing and all these things. Like, to me, it was so different because I grew up in a completely different environment where people were just happy to be able to have food on the table, and they didn't care what brand they were wearing. And so it was very, very different culture. But one of the things that I think too is how my dad helped us because, we're humans and there were times that we would complain. And I remember when we lived in Panama, we didn't have air conditioning. And if you're familiar with Panama, Panama is very hot. It's kind of, I would say the weather's kind of like Florida weather. So very hot and humid all the time, not just during the summer. It's like all year round. And we didn't have air conditioning. And during the time that we were living there, they had a water shortage. So from 12 to 3, they would turn off our water. So we had no water, and that's like the hottest time of the year. And so at the time, it was just my sister and myself that lived at home. My brother was in college here in the United States, and I'm the youngest of 3. And my dad's way of teaching us to not complain was this way he would do. He would tell us, we're going to go for a drive. And we're like, cool, because we're thinking we're going to go in the, the air conditioned car. And we're like, yeah. And my dad's like, I'll get you guys an ice cream cone from McDonald's. And we're like, yeah. And so we drive and he'd take us to downtown Panama, to like the really bad areas of Panama. And he'd do that because he wanted us to reflect on, even though our home didn't have air conditioning, we had so much more to be grateful for. And so as we were driving around Panama City and those areas, and we saw like how the people were living, we immediately realized what we had. And so it was a way that my dad used that technique to show us to be grateful for what we had. And so I still remember it to this day, like, and we still tease him about it. And my dad often says, yeah, I had to take you guys. Sometimes it was like several times a week I had to take you guys out there to remember to be grateful. Yeah.
There's a couple things that stick out to me in that story. One is the brilliance of your dad to not just lecture you.
Yeah.
Because so often as parents, it's really easy for me of just wanting to, give you a sermon about all the reasons that complaining's wrong, or, how, whatever the situation is of, you could have it a lot worse. And just the brilliance that your dad was so creative to model gracefully that shift in your mindset. I think that's brilliant, and really such a valuable lesson for us as parents to recognize that preaching and sermons are good in their time, but there's a lot more taking hold of life transformation when we walk along and disciple our children.
Absolutely.
And helping them really understand and not just tell them they're wrong and why they're wrong. And I love that of how your dad modeled that so well. Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
The other thing that stands out to me is, so you had these experiences in your childhood and you saw firsthand what it was like to do without and to learn gratitude. How has that shaped you now of rearing your own children in the United States versus, because their experience is very different than what your childhood
Absolutely.
experience is. So what does that look like of how you've shaped that as a mother?
Sure. So one of the things that as parents, one of the things that we want our kids to learn is to really to love others, and so one of the things that we do, like we actually, I don't know if this was a good this is a good story, but I remember my kids would complain, like they'd say right before dinner time, I'm starving, I'm starving. I'm like, no, you aren't starving. And I remember one time I showed them a video of kids who really did look like they were starving, and I did that because I wanted them to realize, like, no, that is not accurate. You're very hungry, but you're not starving. Like, there's a difference, so it's really about calling those things out. And it's one of the things that we do a lot. We call those things out when they're maybe not showing gratitude. One of the things too we tend to do a lot is try to parent the heart. And I know you and I have talked about that in the past, about really trying to figure out what is this showing in my child's heart. And that's one of the things that I do with my kids. And when I see that it's lack of gratitude, or I always try to focus on that, like when it's complaining. So then we say, okay, let's talk about things that we're grateful for. So when I see my kids, we have this rule in our home, actually, when my kids start to complain about stuff, then I make them say 3 things that they're grateful for right there on the spot. It's like trying to combat the attitude of complaining. And so those are some ways that we do. We have a lot of conversations in our house about people that don't have. One of the things that our church does is we have a homeless outreach. And so we get our kids involved in that. They help with packing the homeless kits, and just trying to really model to them a heart of compassion for others. When like, for example, if we're out and about and we see someone who is homeless, a normal reaction that people often have is like they are fearful, but I always try to point out, like, these are still people, and God loves these people. Like, we don't know their story, but they're still people. So it's always trying to instill that compassion in our kids towards others.
And I think in light of everything that's taking place in our world today, right, there's a lot of conversation about compassion. But I think that one of the things that stands out to me is what you said a minute ago. It's also a reflection of our heart. And unless our hearts are truly changed, then we're not going to have a heart of gratitude. We're going to not have a heart of compassion. We're going to have a heart of judgment. And so just in light of everything that is going on in the world and all the different conversations that are taking place, I think you really hit the nail on the head, that it's a heart issue for all of us, because it doesn't matter if you're a child or if you're an adult. If our hearts have not been transformed and changed by Jesus, then that sin is going to be a reflection of our actions, our words, our deeds. And so just helping, first and foremost, for ourselves individually, but then as we're modeling that for our children and the platforms that God's given us, of helping us all to understand that really at the root of all that is taking place in our world today, it's a heart issue.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. So tell me, what has God currently been teaching you, just in light of the last few months? What's God currently teaching you?
I think one of the things that stands out, I think it's amazing how God uses different ways of emphasizing what we need to learn. I don't know if that makes sense, but like he can use your pastor, or obviously his word, or situations or books that you're reading and things like that. And one of the things that stands out to me the most is just about having a heart that is humble, a heart that is able to be flexible. You have to have humility to be able to be flexible, right? Because if you're proud and stiff, you can't be flexible. So really, flexibility comes from that heart that is humble. And so also, like, being humble in order to to hear God's voice and to hear what he's speaking to you, you have to have that heart that is humble, a heart that is humble in relationship with my husband, right? Like I know that probably, I want to say probably about 100% of the issues that we've had, it's probably because someone's not being humble, and being able to hear the other person. And it's all about, oh, well, what about me? Or my feelings are hurt, or why didn't you do this for me? So it's that attitude again of pride. And so when those things creep into your heart, then it causes conflict. And then also with everything, like you said, everything that's going on in the world, the pandemic, what we've seen recently with, everything that happened with the police brutality and all of that, it's really about having a heart that is humble to be able to hear and listen to others and hear their experiences. And it's not easy, but I think that's the stance that we should have as believers, is to have a heart that is humble, that it's not about politics, it's about justice, it's about really hearing their voices and really being able to stand alongside them. And even though, we might be from different experiences and different perspectives, but being able to say, yes, this is not okay. Like we should always be willing to stand out for what honors God, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. How has that been, or has it been challenging for you so you have all these different platforms, you're a wife, you're a mother, you're a pastor's wife, you're a teacher. How have you been able to not lose your identity and your voice in who God created you to be, in all those different roles? Because I think one of the things that probably you and I have observed over the years is that for moms, it can be really challenging to not get lost in a role, right? For some, it can be struggling as a mom of just feeling like you only change diapers and you lose your identity as a woman, or who you were pre-mom, and things like that. And so how have you been able to really not lose your voice and to embrace being a leader in your different platforms that God is giving you?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I didn't mention was, prior to becoming a teacher and becoming a mom, actually, I was a therapist. I was a school-based therapist. So I've always worked in the school setting. I've always loved that. So prior to that, I was a therapist, and that was like my identity. I saw myself when people ask you, oh, what do you do? Or who are you? I'm a therapist. That's what I would say. And so when Emma was born, we decided that I would stay at home and be able to raise her. And that was a decision that we made for us. And so when I became a stay-at-home mom, I remember I started to question, like, well, who am I? I went through this like identity crisis in a way, because I felt like who I was no longer a therapist. And I often question my identity. And when we moved to the DC area, there's so many people who are so driven there that when I would say that I was a stay-at-home mom, I almost felt like I had to also say, well, I used to be a therapist. And then they'd be like, oh, that's cool. When are you planning to go back?
Yes.
Yeah. And so it was definitely, there was a moment in my life that I felt like I didn't know who I was, but the thing is that if you place your identity on what you do, then you're going to have those moments. And I really had to learn that my identity was not on what I did. It was in the fact that I am God's child. I am his daughter. That's who I am, And so maybe in this season of my life, I'm not working as a therapist, but I don't cease from being God's child. Like that will always be there, And so I had to really learn that my identity was based on Christ, not on what I did. And so I want to encourage moms, young moms especially, that maybe have had this experience too, that it's going to be for a season, especially when they're really little. Then I think you can really start to use your gifts. Like one of my gifts has always been the gift of encouragement. When I was a therapist, that's what I did, right? And now and I mean, you even do that as a mom, I was doing that as a mom. So my gifts I was still using my gifts, but it wasn't how I thought I was supposed to be using them. I was still encouraging my kids and helping them. And and then when I started working as a teacher, again, that's an area where I was really able to use that gift of encouragement, encouraging my students. It's also that being aware, like one of the gifts that God has given me is that gift of discernment. And I could tell when a kid was struggling, and even if they said they weren't, and it was just that word of encouragement saying, hey, I know you may not want to tell me how you're doing. I could tell you're not doing well. I just want you to know I'm praying for you. It's just something as simple like that can really help a kid know someone cares for me, And so I think it's really about holding on to who you are as a believer, who you are as a child of God. And that, I think, really helped me when I focused on that. Then whatever season I was in my life, like that was who I was. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
no, I love that. And I think that's so valuable for all of us as women to recognize that there's going to be different seasons. There's going to be different things that God calls you to do that he may not call me to do. And just being able to encourage one another in whatever season or area of life that we're in. But I think the most important thing that you pointed out is recognizing that our identity comes from him, and that abiding in him is where we get our identity. And then we're not so caught up with the natural comparison of comparing my season to your season.
Absolutely.
And so I think that for those moms who are listening, of just recognizing that, we're all going to look different in our seasons, but recognizing that our identity shouldn't be one of comparison, but our identity should be one of abiding in Christ and getting our true identity from him. Okay. And I think that especially, you mentioned about the DC culture, I think that it is challenging in our world of the immediate go-to is the what do you do, instead of more of who we are in Christ. And if we can help make that shift, and also just being able to use the gifts, the spiritual gifts that God gives us, how amazing that we have the opportunity to use those in every season.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. Because that's at the core of who God has designed us to be, and how we bring him glory. And so regardless of the season, we have that opportunity to walk in the giftings that he's given us.
Yeah. And those gifts make you uniquely you, right? Yeah. Like we're all God's children, but you are uniquely you because of those gifts God has given you. So being able to use those in every season you're in, even with your children, I definitely do encourage my kids a lot.
Absolutely. And that gifting of being able to do that uniquely and creatively. In fact, what would be, I know that you're very intentional to parent from a biblical worldview, and I know that you're very intentional to make sure that your home is created from a biblical worldview. So what would you say is one thing that you have really been intentional to create that biblical worldview and how you go about life in your home?
Sure. So early on, when my kids were, I want to say about maybe 3 and 1, my husband and I decided to come up with a family mission statement. And so that mission statement is actually based on Micah 6:8. So in a nutshell, it's the three phrases that we've taught our kids is do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And so those are like the 3 things that we really try to emphasize in our home. So when we're disciplining our kids, when we're talking to them about things that are going on, especially right now with what's going on in our nation and the divisiveness and all that, we go back to that. We go back to our mission statement, which is really scripture, right? And so we always try to have conversations about that, like about doing kindness and being forgiving, right? And depending on God. My husband actually is doing a series in the Minor Prophets at our church, And we were talking about Micah on Sunday. And in this verse in particular, when it says walk humbly with your God, he explained that in its original language, the way it's actually written, because the way we see it is like maybe having a stance or a posture of humility. But he was saying it's actually showing, it's kind of like, this is how he described it, it's kind of like when somebody hurts themselves, for example, in a game, a football game, and they get hurt, and a team member comes over and they help them out, they physically walk with them, right? And the other person is depending on them. That's what walking humbly with your God means. It's you leaning on him and depending on him. There's this dependency on God. And so I think it goes back to that when we're parenting, and even when we make mistakes, we always are quick to say, you know what, I made a mistake. Maybe not quick to say, sometimes it takes a while. we do acknowledge, hey, you know what, I didn't handle that very well. And we have these moments of confession and forgiveness. And what does that do? It shows to your kids, it reflects to your kids, hey, I need God just as much as you need God. We need God. And I'm able to have this experience with them in which I will sometimes we'll pray together and we'll ask God to, forgive us, and we'll ask God to help us in those areas. And so I think it's important for the kids to hear that. Like just today I was walking, I like to do prayer walks in the morning. And my son has started joining me. And so I'll just be praying out loud. And today I was just asking God for patience, like patience with the kids, and patience with being wise with what I say and how to, and my son is listening to me, and I think it's good for him to hear that. It's good for him to hear that I need God, I'm asking God to help me. And that is probably the best gift you can give your child versus pretending to be perfect and having it all together, because we can't. And so being able to reflect to my kids that, hey, I am so in need of God. And that's what it means to where it says walk humbly with your God. It's admitting that I am in desperate need of him.
I love that. And I love that he's joining you and hearing you communicate with God, because that's something he will never forget. And what an amazing example to him, to have that dependence. I think one of the things that you said that sticks out to me is I think one of the challenges as a parent is, when our kids are really young, we're their heroes, right? And almost kind of can do no wrong in their eyes because they look up to us and everything that we do and say,
Absolutely.
And as they grow and mature and hit that, middle school and high school and college years, then just that recognition, they see our imperfections a lot more quickly. And so being able to have, I know for me, having to be just real and vulnerable and recognizing that they see my mistakes, and like you said, being quick to ask forgiveness, but also just, I think for them also just modeling, because I think it's hard for me to go from that place of being almost perfect, if you will, in their eyes, to I feel like constantly making mistakes, and then they really see your humanity and they really see your sinfulness and all the mistakes that you make daily, but then also being able to say, but we're all imperfected. We're all going to make mistakes. None of us are perfect except for Jesus. And just letting them be a part of that shaping and molding, and letting them be a part of that repentance and forgiveness, I think is really important and key. And it's hard. I mean, it is hard to have that shift in how much of the imperfection they start to see in our lives. Talk to me real quickly about, because you mentioned, and I think probably some of our audience members would be interested in this, you mentioned about having a mission statement for your family. I know this is something that my husband Todd and I have done in the past, of creating that mission statement. But for somebody who's like, what's a mission statement? What does that even look like? How do you come up with one? Why do you need one? Talk to us a little bit about why you and your husband chose to do that, what that's looked like, and maybe how that has helped shape and create a center stone for how you do family.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important, just like most organizations, right? They all have a mission statement to kind of, it defines who you are, right? And that's really what a mission statement does. It defines you. And so I think as a family, we wanted something that defined us and that also guided us as far as how we do everything, right? And really that's what it does. It helps us as we're parenting our kids. It helps us to go back to that and remember these are our values, right? This is what we want our kids in the end. It's kind of like schools who have mission statements, right? And then they say when the student graduates, this is how they should be reflective of these things. I think the same way with the family mission statement. Like when our kids leave our home, these are the things that we want to see. For us, it's Micah 6:8. Are they forgiving people, right? Are they concerned about justice? Are they walking humbly with God? Are they dependent on God? And those are the things that we want to highlight. So really the way we developed it was my husband and I began it by writing down what do we value, right? What are the things that are important to us as believers in our home? What is important to us? So we started writing like different characteristics and different things that we thought were valuable. And as we were writing them down, it was like, oh, relationship with God. You know, we want our kids to, like, we were thinking, okay, when our kids are 18, what do we want to see in them? That's how we kind of came up with that. And we're like, well, we want kids who love God and love others, and our kids who are speaking out for what's wrong. And, you know, all these different things we started talking about. And then my husband's like, well, that sounds like Micah 6:8. So then that's kind of how we were able to come up with Micah 6:8. And I think for everyone, every family, it's going to be different, right? And so I think also, I think a lot of it has to do with what our passions are. My husband is very passionate about biblical justice. And so for him, obviously in our home, that's going to be something that is very, very important. So that is probably why for our home, Micah 6:8 is our mission statement. But I think for everyone, it's going to be different, right? And it has a lot to do with how God wired you, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it takes into account, your mission statement is going to take into account how you are wired, what your gifts are, what you want to instill in your kids. And it should be led by scripture. You know, obviously it should be founded on biblical principles, not necessarily, you know, our own like values, but really it should be focused on what the Bible says, you know, at least for Christian homes. So.
And I see and hear just beautifully how your life and your childhood as a missionary kid and that interweaving and your spiritual gift of encouragement and discernment, and how that is all interwoven, and then how you then incorporate and do life and create those boundaries then as a family. Because talk to me for a minute, for those who are listening who are like, well, how do I even get started in creating? It's a great idea, you did a mission statement, but I don't know how to get started. Mm-hmm. Talk to me also about, because I think what it also does is it uses the gifts and abilities of how God has created you and your husband, what you're wanting to frame as a biblical worldview for parenting in your family. But I would venture to guess that it also helps keep you grounded in, if there's other distractions or things that come up, that then you can also say, does this reflect our mission statement as a family? And if it doesn't, then that probably is something that you're not going to be involved in or not want to do. Mm-hmm. So how does that help keep you grounded as a family for those who this idea may be new about developing a mission statement?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it does. You're right. It does help us out as far as like determining, is this something that is going to be beneficial to our kids? You know, like, is this something that is going to help foster a passion for others or for God? So really, like, even thinking about like activities that my kids are involved in, you know, I always think of it that way. Like, is this going to be something that's going to help them to be able to, or give them experience in how to be loving and how to be, right, you know, forgiving And I know, like, for my daughter is extremely athletic, and so she wants to be in all the sports. But it has helped her to really it's challenged her because she can be very competitive, right? And so it's challenged her to be forgiving of herself, because sometimes more than anything, she's hard on herself. She's a lot like her mom, like that too. And so it's helped her to be forgiving on her with herself. And so I really think it does help dictate what we choose to do and what we watch and what we see and what we, who we hang out with and all those things. Like, it's really helped us to create a home a home that's focused, I think. You know what I mean? Like, it's a home that is focused. And I think that is why we value our mission statement so much. But that is definitely a way. A way is really just to start is just jot down what is valuable to you. Like, what is important to you and your family and your spouse. Like, what's important, what matters. And think about the end goal. Like, what do you want your kids to take? What's the take home kind of thing,
Right. Because I think that that's really, as far as when you're talking about practicals, making a list of what's valuable. If you sit down with your husband, make those lists of what is your value system. I'm very passionate about having a game plan in life, as far as, like, you mentioned this also. If our children are 3, what do we want to be the attitudes and behaviors when they're 18, right? And so we always have to be forward thinking. And I think that family mission statements really help us be forward thinking, because it allows us to have kind of blinders on to know, like, where we're going and to be able to stay focused of what God's called us to. So yeah, I would say that if you have anything else to add, but writing down practicals as far as what you want to be the values in your home. And then you can just create 1 or 2 sentences using those, things that you jotted down. So it really doesn't have to be elaborate. I think some people can be overwhelmed of, like, the business model.
No, not at all.
In reality, it's a few key points that are values, and then just making 1 or 2 sentences that incorporate those values.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, I really think it does go back to being intentional. Like, I actually learned that a lot from you, Shemin, about being intentional as parents. And I think when you have a mission statement, what's more intentional than that? Because that is like, that's guiding you. Again, it helps you to think, how are we going to get there? How are we going to help our kids to love God so deeply that they know how to depend on him, and they love others, that they speak out for injustices. And so I think it's for us, because that's what matters to us. And so I think really that is an intentional way of raising kids.
We're almost out of time. I want to ask you just 1 or 2 more questions. If any of our audience members have any questions for Naomi, feel free down in the box to write in those questions, and I will hopefully get to those before our time is up. But Naomi, as we've been doing these motherhood leadership webinars, one of the things that I think is really valuable, that I'm wanting to create the conversation and wanting to create of training our brains, is recognizing that as mothers, we are leaders. And we're leaders of this generation and of the next generation, as we're shaping world changers who will then take platform positions in the world. And so how do you see that if we embrace this idea that motherhood is a leadership opportunity, how do you think that's going to transform and change the trajectory of the world? Because if we really own that a mother is a leader, I think that kind of changes our outlook on motherhood. It changes how we embrace motherhood, and recognizing that, we have a lot of platforms, but we should never undermine the leadership of a mom. How do you think that would shift our world culture if we really embrace that idea?
Well, I think it's such a unique role as a mom, because we really do have the power to be able to change the world, like you said, because we are raising the next generation, right? And so I think I'm going to be very real and I'm going to give a very practical way, especially given what's going on in our country. And as a woman of color, what we've done in our home to be able to help our kids make a difference when it comes to race and racism. And so, you know, one of the things that we try to do is we are very open with our kids, and we talk about these things to our kids. And I'm going to give you an example of something that happened when my kids were really little. One of the first times that we actually had this conversation with them, I want to say our kids were maybe like 5 and 3, or maybe 6 and 4. I can't remember. They were little, and we were talking about, this was actually I can't remember the case exactly, but I know there was a case of police brutality. And so we were just kind of talking to the kids about how not all people are treated the same based on their skin color, unfortunately. And, you know, to kids, it's hard for them to understand that. And so we were at a restaurant, we're having this conversation. And when we got up to go, there was a couple next to us, an older white couple next to us. And she looked at me and she said, "That's too deep of a conversation to have with children." And I was like, part of me was already like, "And it's none of your business." I wanted to say that. But instead I said, yes, but it's an important and necessary one to have with them. And so it made me realize that a lot of families don't have these conversations with their kids. You know, people of color have these conversations with their kids all the time, but it's not the same with Christian white families. And I think one of the things that a lot of white families do is they think, oh, well, I'm going to teach them to love others. I'm going to teach them to be kind. And, you know, but a lot of times that's not enough. Like, we need to be able to be, to show them to be empathic, you know. And how do you show someone to be empathic? You show them to be empathic by hearing other people's experiences and stories, and really by loving, you know. Because when I think about justice, I think, why is God calling us out to do what's right? Like, to be people that hate injustices. Why? Well, it's because he loves people, right? And so that should be our stance too. But we can't teach our kids to love others if we don't teach them their stories, you know? And so I think it's important to have those conversations, even though they're really uncomfortable. Even for us as people of color, it's hard for us to talk to our kids about this. It's so hard. And so, I know that for us, like just the other day, we watched the movie Selma. And right now there's a lot of movies out there. I think if you have Amazon Prime, they're all free right now, as you really want to bring awareness of the Black community and Black history. And so we watched that with the kids. And in the scene, which would have been called, I think it was it's called Bloody Sunday, when the protesters were crossing the bridge and they were attacked by, I want to say state troops, I believe. It was really hard for my kids to watch it. And Emma started crying, and Elam, I could tell he was on the verge of tears. And part of me as a mom wanted to be like, let's turn this off, this is too hard, you know. But instead we paused it and we had conversations about it. And my son was like, Mom, I don't understand why do people not, why are they treating them badly? Why are they, you know, like having these questions. And the thing that I think is important for kids to realize that why. Now Elam is having empathy, right? It's really what is being fostered in him is empathy. Was it an easy conversation? No, it wasn't. Did it break my heart to see them sad? Absolutely. But I think what I did there was I helped them realize, like, these are people, right? These are people that God loves. And people were treating them unjust. And so we need to speak out for them. And I think for them, it was important to have that moment, those emotions. Why? Because now that's going to help them to see people differently, right? And it's not just with issues of race, but it could be with bullying, right? When you can be empathic, you're going to do something. So I think that's a very practical way, you know, about being open and having conversations and just reading things, watching things together, having conversations, even if you feel uncomfortable. It's really about creating a space for kids to talk about this. And that way they can understand and hear stories of those who are oppressed.
Would you say that the same is true as far as the way, because you did distinguish just now as far as the ongoing conversation that you would have with your children, but that I think I heard you correctly, that you don't think that white families have those same conversations maybe as frequently or at all. So what would you say to someone like me who's like, how do we best incorporate those conversations to develop that empathy, you know, so that it is more than so that empathy runs deep. And one of the things that actually kind of, I think, comes full circle here is even your father's example of when you ask someone their name and their story, it helps us create humanity.
Absolutely.
And love and kindness. And
Yeah.
I think that regardless of what color you are, I think that should be at the core of when we take the time to ask, tell me your story. Tell me, who's your husband? Who are your kids? Tell me, what is your story? But do you have any other specific examples that you would say maybe you wish that white families did do a better job of how to teach that we can learn?
I think a good place to start is really talking about the history in our country. Being able to start there, you know, being able to have kids realize, like, you know, unfortunately, our Black community has been oppressed for many, many years. And so it's an uncomfortable conversation, but it's a necessary one. Like, that's what I was telling that baby, right?
Right, absolutely.
Necessary, you know? And so I think it's important for kids to be aware of the history behind it, right? But also, like you said, of developing relationships, you know? So I think it's about looking like, do I have friends that are people of color, you know? And if I do, have I ever had them over for dinner? Have our kids had interactions with them, you know? So it's really about creating this openness and even having awkward conversations, right? Like, Shaman, you were the first person that has, outside of people of color, the first white person that has ever asked me, like, tell me about your experience of discrimination. Have you ever had experience of discrimination? Tell me about them. Like, you were the first person to have ever asked me that. And I think I was about 35 when you asked me that, which is sad. You know, that is really sad. And I've had lots of white friends. You're the only one the first person to ask me that. And so I think it's really important to teach our kids to really care deeply. And that is one way, modeling to them, right? Caring with our friends who are people of color and asking those questions that maybe are uncomfortable to ask, but it shows that you care. Yeah.
That's so good. We definitely have a long ways to go in individual family homes as a country. But again, I think just to tie all of this together, I think that we have an opportunity as mothers to create the new normal. I mean, we really have a platform of changing the future and the trajectory of to show that empathy, because we model that. And we either model discrimination or we model embracing and asking, tell me your story. And I think that moms have that leadership opportunity day in and day out. So, well, Naomi, I so appreciate this time together. I can't believe our time is already we're out of time already. And yet you're a wealth of information. You're a wealth of knowledge. I learn from you every time I have a conversation with you. I love your vulnerability and you're just being practical and real. And I think that all of our audience members can really just be encouraged, but also be inspired in how we can develop empathy by getting to know, like your father did so well for you, of modeling, asking questions about the people around us, not just being so quick and wrapped up in our own worlds, but being able to think and look outside our own four walls, and do that well as just learning how to develop that mission statement for our homes and for our families so that we can be intentional. Because I think that's one of the greatest takeaways from this conversation, is that we have the opportunity to be intentional. And so how do we do that so that we are using our time wisely in the platforms that God has given us? So I appreciate this time. I appreciate this conversation. I've learned a lot from you always, and I thank you for your sharing your wisdom with our audience members today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's definitely a pleasure, and time went by fast. And
it did. There's always so much to talk about. We could talk all day. Yes, thank you.
I know. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you to all of our audience members. And we will be back with you next Tuesday, every Tuesday, 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and we will see you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.